Grace, mercy, and peace to you, Internet, and welcome back to Lutheran in a Strange Land. We are now on Part 7 of Cultivating Chastity. Links to the previous parts are in the description below, and we're just going to get right into it, but if you haven't checked out last time, please watch that one first, especially, before getting into this one, because last time we talked about the natural law, the law written on our hearts, where it concerns sexual morality. And we talked about how, just like on some level we all know that murder is wrong, right? Even murderers know that murder is wrong. That's why they excuse themselves by saying, they weren't really innocent, they had it coming, that sort of thing. They have to rationalize because they know that murder is wrong. It's really the same thing when it comes to knowing that sex outside of marriage is wrong. That is written on the heart. That is part of the natural law. On some level, we all realize that. And we looked at some of the colloquial rules in American culture that we have regarding sexual morality, if you can call it morality. People don't usually even think of it that way, but yeah, there are a lot of moral attitudes about what's good and what's bad, and a lot of moral rules even that you have to follow, or else you're very much in the wrong. And we talked about that last time. And it's not much. I mean, they aren't good rules most of the time, but we did pick up a pattern in all that chaos. Specifically, we found that if you look at all the things that most people believe about sex in America today, and you compare all of them to each other, what we find is that people believe that sex ought to be within an intimate union of mutual self-giving between two complementary people that's founded in a permanent and exclusive commitment to each other's good. Which, again, is just a long-winded way of saying that sex belongs with marriage. So, if on some level, and again, that's not, most people aren't going to stand up and repeat that or anything, but what the things that they do believe, and you can see that they believe, you take all those together and add them up, that is what you more or less end up with. So if on some level, even your typical American understands this, how then do we get to the kind of licentiousness that we find in our culture? And the answer is that it just kind of goes back to the nature of evil. And every bad thing, every evil thing is really a good thing that has been spoiled in some way. St. Augustine talked about this a lot. Evil, you can think of it ultimately as a kind of uncreation, where God created a very good world, created a lot of very good things in this world, but then through sin we've distorted those things, we've broken those things, we've caused those things to decay in different ways. We've uncreated them, as it were. Think about humans. God formed us out of the dust of the ground, and then we sin, and we return to dust. So it's the coming apart of what was once put together, and that's how most evil things work. So when you think of evil, we're not thinking about some kind of equal and opposite force to good, like you see in certain Eastern religions or in dualistic philosophies, where there's the yin and the yang, and they're like two opposite forces competing with each other. But rather, evil is a deprivation of good. It's a twisting of creation. So if you're going to take evil and you're going to try to promote it, you're trying to sell it to other people, evil always has to be dressed up. It has to appear good in some way. And we can usually manage to do this because evil came from good in some way. It was good that was broken down in some way. So there's usually some aspects of that original goodness they can still point to in order to sell it as a good thing. And the same thing with human virtue. We lose chastity very much the same way. We talk about all those different elements of sexual morality, and what we end up doing is that we exaggerate certain aspects of it in order to drown out other aspects of it. So turning up the volume on one part so that you can't really hear some of the other parts that you don't want to hear as much. They blur them out, fuzz them out, obscure them in some way. But when we distort sexual morality in that way, if it's a way that catches on, it's a way that it seems plausibly good, because we are drawing on the real elements of chastity, the real elements of sexual morality. And let's go through an example. The most popular distortion when I was growing up and which is still very big today, is serial monogamy, right? And for younger viewers, it's basically how people got together before hookup culture. And although, to be fair, a lot of people still practice serial monogamy today, even in hookup culture, even on the periphery of hookup culture, because in many respects, hookups are just kind of seen as filling the time in between longer-term relationships. So what is serial monogamy? Basically, is moving from one temporarily exclusive relationship to the next. So, you have a boyfriend, and he's your only boyfriend, right? You're not seeing anybody else. And so that's your relationship until it's not anymore. And then you break it off, and then you find the new boyfriend. And you have the same arrangement. You're just with him until you end the relationship, and then you go to the next boyfriend, and so on and so forth. Then you get a boyfriend, and then he becomes your husband eventually. And then you divorce him, and then you move on to the next boyfriend. So basically a string of temporarily exclusive relationships. And you can think of it as kind of a pretend temporary monogamy. It looks kind of like it because you have this either implicit or explicit agreement with one another that, we're not going to be with anybody else while we're together. But you also know at the same time, it's like, well, we're not going to be together forever. We're going to be together until one of us doesn't want to be anymore. So, serial monogamy, or as sometimes called, less often, successive polygamy. It's basically, you could describe it that way just as fairly. So, in any case, serial monogamy, it seemed like a plausible sexual morality because it acknowledges the need for committed relationships that are based on mutual self-giving and actually caring about one another's well-being. And then it turns up the volume on ideas about intimacy, specifically in the form of romantic feelings and pleasure. And then, because the volume on that aspect is so loud, it drowns out and softens the ideas about exclusivity until it goes from one person to one person at a time. And it seems plausible, but there's still something very clearly dishonest about denying exclusivity as part of sexual morality. And you can see this in the way that we lie about it. Because when long-term relationships are on the table, all of a sudden, the number of partners that your prospective relationship has had in the past, well, that suddenly becomes important to you, right? I mean, you might not care about how many one-night stands your one-night stand has had, as long as you're using protection anyway. But, if a man says that it makes no difference to him whether his fiancée that he's taking home to meet his parents, whether she has been with 0 other guys or whether she's been with 50 other guys, if he says that, he's lying. Or else he's the kind of guy who has literally been with hundreds of women and he's burnt out his sexuality beyond the point of caring about that sort of thing anymore. And so yeah, people do still care about that. And again, we mentioned this last time, but the fact that women tend to lie about the number of partners that they've had really underscores the reality here. People go to a lot of effort to pretend that their past doesn't matter. But you can tell it's this pretense, again, because of all the lies that go on in these kinds of relationships. So even if you're just talking about softening exclusivity, there's already something dishonest about what we're doing here. But it doesn't stop there. And that's kind of the interesting thing about how these distortions turn out in the long run. Because sexuality, it's a tapestry. It's just too complete of a weaving where you can just, pull out one thread but not expect the rest to unravel when you do it. Serial monogamy, it cannot succeed in denying one facet of sexual morality, the exclusivity, while leaving all the other facets intact. And this is probably the most obvious when it comes to the criteria of commitment, right? You're supposed to be in a committed relationship. But what does commitment mean? Well, in reality, commitments between people are made by means of promises. You promise something to the other person. That's your commitment. But in serial monogamy, the only promise that anybody in those relationships is making to one another is that basically, I promise to say goodbye to you before I start sleeping with somebody else. Which, that's not a particularly meaningful promise there. It's very thin as far as promises go. And that thinness is perhaps why it so often turns into a commitment to say goodbye after you start sleeping with somebody else, as long as you intend to continue sleeping with them in the future, and then you hide it otherwise. So, in the end, if you get rid of exclusivity, it doesn't just soften commitment, it annihilates commitment. You talk about people in committed relationships today outside of marriage, and if you actually ask them what's their commitment, what have they actually promised to one another, 9 times out of 10, they don't even have an answer to that, because it's never even occurred to them that commitment means making a promise to somebody. So yeah, there's no real commitment going on in serial monogamy. It's just basically just a pleasant fiction for everybody involved, so they can kind of have a pretend mini marriage going on. So yeah, commitment goes away. And intimacy also starts going away, because your inhibitions really start coming back after time, because each partner in the relationship starts holding themselves back from one another. Because over time, you learn that you should not invest too deeply in the other person, because odds are you're just going to end up in a painful breakup with them eventually when you move on to the next person. So why would you want to emotionally invest too much? You're going to try to keep your distance. You're going to try to keep that safe zone just to avoid being hurt again. And that's the thing, when people who are in long-term relationships, they expect their they expect their partners to be intimate with them, to be giving towards them, but they themselves, they want to hold it back. Again, it's kind of to avoid getting hurt. You're going to try to keep your private life private. You're going to cut off a part of yourself from the other person. You're going to keep your separate bank accounts. You're going to keep your options open with respect to other people. You're going to have some people. Women will have some guys in the friend zone that they can pull out if they really need to. Although they hope it doesn't come to that. And guys will certainly have a roving eye and make sure it's like, yeah, I could go with that person if I really wanted to, or I could pursue a relationship there if I really wanted to. You keep your options open. You don't want to invest too deeply. So intimacy starts disappearing because of that. And as that happens, self-giving, that aspect of sexuality breaks down as well, because you realize that you're not really giving yourself to another person at all. At best, you are offering a loan. You can have me a little bit for this time until I want to take it back, and then it's over. And really, the only thing that you're giving that you're not going to be able to take back at the end is just your time that you spend with them. And people in these long-term relationships, they'll expect their partners to act as though they're already married, right? As though, oh, I'm devoted to just you, and you're supposed to give yourself to me. But they don't hold themselves to the same standard, just as it is with intimacy. They expect the other person to be the committed one, whereas you want to give a more measured commitment. And of course, the partners see it exactly the same way. They don't want to commit all the way either, so they just give a measured kind of pseudo-commitment. And so on both sides, the relationship ends up being set up for inevitable disappointment, because nobody's really the other person is not doing what the first person wants, and vice versa. It's not what either person's really looking for. So that the serial part of serial monogamy, it ends up just being this kind of acid that dissolves the entire endeavor over time. And so you can't just soften exclusivity that way and have it not affect all these other aspects of sexual morality. I mean, there's a reason that we ended up with hookup culture coming out of sexual morality. But people do try to salvage it, right? It doesn't go well. It causes all these problems. And so this in turn spawns a bunch of workarounds where people desperately try to kludge it until it kind of works a little bit again. People will try to work around that expectation of faithfulness by changing marriage vows from "till death do us part" to stuff like, well, as long as we both shall grow, or other meaningless nonsense like that. Or people will have moving in ceremonies if they don't get married, but we're moving in together and it's supposed to be meaningful, and you have again, you have some happy words, you solemnize it a little bit, but you make sure you don't actually make any promises. So again, you still have the same deception in there. And you can see this working on pop culture as well. For example, there's the workaround in the movie Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, which, spoiler warning, I'm about to spoil the entire movie for you here. So in that movie, if you haven't seen it, Jim Carrey and Kate Winslet, they're playing two characters who are in a relationship with one another, but they become so sick of each other that they actually go to have their memories erased. So there's kind of a science fiction element to this, right? So they have their memories of each other erased, so they're total strangers to each other. But then they end up meeting again afterward, and they end up beginning another romance. But then they end up discovering what happened in the past. And so they have this conversation about it, and Kate Winslet's character, she just wants to call the whole thing off, right? Because, well, we know that we're just going to end up hating each other. So we can't have that, so we should just break it off now. But Jim Carrey, he responds by saying, okay. As in, he's willing to accept that eventually they're going to hate each other. But he still wants to pursue the relationship. And he's willing to end up with a nasty breakup as long as they can be happy for a short time together and have some good memories together. And it's a really sad movie because that ending is really intended to be joyful, right? It's supposed to be positive. That's how the viewer's supposed to walk away from it, feeling, oh yeah, there is meaning in these relationships after all. But the idea that the best you can hope for is a few happy memories before becoming miserable, well, yeah, that's an exceptionally dismal happy ending going on there. Again, there's a reason that serial monogamy is devolving into hookup culture. You don't want to have those unhappy breakups. The few good memories aren't worth the horrible pains, and so you just don't bother with the relationships in the first place, or at least that's how a lot of people see it. And I'm saying, we can try to rearrange our expectations. You can try to manage it a little bit to just make that work. But it can't work. It's never going to work because our expectations, they're not something we're simply taught. They're not forced on us by tradition. As we've already seen, they exist within the framework of a normal human mind. The only way we can actually escape those expectations is by ceasing to be human altogether. So that's really the big distortion of the last generation or two. That's how people twisted natural law. But there are certainly other distortions, or perhaps excuses might be a better word for it, that people will be using. A lot of people will say that, well, yeah, okay, sex does belong with marriage. I'll acknowledge that. But, there's always a but. But don't we have to figure out first if we can be happy married? And this is where you get into the idea, if you want to be crass about it, this is where you get into the idea of test drives, right? That we have to take each other for a test drive just to make sure everything's working the way we expect it to before we make a lifelong commitment. And sure, there's a certain amount of deception going on with these. It's like, okay, why does everybody want to test out this aspect of a relationship first, right? And why does everybody seem to want to just test it out a bunch of times just to make sure? So there's some deception going on there. And you still end up running into the same problems because even if you say, oh yeah, we do need to take test drives, it still matters to you how many test drives your prospective spouse has had at the end of the day. People still worry about their numbers even when they think about test drives. If you want to be less crass about it, you can look at it in terms of cohabitation, right? People don't want to get married right away, but they'll move in together and have a sexual relationship together, living in sin, as we used to call it, in order to just try it on, make sure it works before they sign any papers. But this really doesn't work either. Again, marriage depends on commitment. And living together with a commitment where you have promised to be with this person and only this person till death do you part, that's a fundamentally different experience than living together with somebody without any kind of commitment. Because as you're learning to relate to one another, as you're learning to, in many cases, cope with one another, because everybody has bad habits or what that you'd rather the other person doesn't have, you learn to cope with any kind of problems you encounter by remembering that, well, you do have an escape hatch if necessary. You can pull the plug on this thing if you have to. And that's a very different coping strategy than what you'll come up with if you've promised to be with this person for the rest of your life. And that's probably why people who have cohabited before marriage, they're between 33 and 151% more likely to divorce than people who did not cohabit before marriage. Again, it depends which study you read, but pretty much every study will say there is a significant increase in risk. And again, I think it's because of how you learn to cope very, very differently in those kinds of situations. So yeah, that excuse doesn't work very well in practice. Sounds plausible at first glance, because it seems to support the sex with marriage thing, just making a little exception. But when you actually walk through it does not work that way. Other people make the excuse that, well, yeah, sex belongs with marriage, but we're already married in our hearts because of the deep love that we have for one another. And, standing before a minister and saying some words or signing some papers, that's not going to make us any more in love than we already are. That's kind of the romantic excuse for sex before marriage. And this is the older one. This is one when premarital sex was sex that you had with the person you're going to marry just before you married. So if you're going to go with that route, if you're going to make that excuse, well, what do you have to do to love at that point? Well, you have to turn love into a feeling for that to be true. That the fact that you have these romantic feelings for each other, this love for each other, that makes you more married than most married couples are. Well, that means love is just a feeling, nothing more than how you feel about the other person. Otherwise, what you'd be saying there is that you can have some kind of commitment without actually having a commitment. Your feelings become the commitment if you're using that excuse. But it really does not work that well, because you can't actually promise to have a feeling. And that's not what marriage vows are. What marriage vows are specific public promises to one another to that uphold marriage's purposes. It's not promising to feel a specific way about the other person, because you're not going to feel the same way about the person over the years. Even in happy relationships, the way you feel still changes with time, because both people are changing with time. It can change from one positive thing to another positive thing to still another positive thing, but it's still changing. You're not feeling the same way. You're never going to feel exactly the same way forever. So you do actually have to have a real commitment, an actual promise that goes beyond just how you feel about each other, because feelings change. But then they'll say, oh, well, we've made that commitment privately to one another. Yeah, we didn't stand up in front of a minister or or a judge or in some kind of public ceremony, but we have committed to one another privately, right? But that really doesn't wash either, because the whole reason that you have marriage ceremonies where you make the promise in front of other people is so that everybody knows that you've made the promise, so that they can help you fulfill it. They can hold you to your vows. Without that, it's just a lot more easy to abuse. I can think of in Don Quixote. There's this subplot about a man who he sneaks into a woman's bedchamber at night, and he wants to sleep with her, and well, she doesn't want to because they're not married. So he convinces her, okay, let's get married right now, right here in this room with nobody around, and they do. And he, of course, runs off later. He's trying to marry some other girl later on. So yeah, it's obviously that can be very much abused. But even if you're not intending to be deceptive about it, it is much, much, much easier to break promises that nobody else ever knew about, except for the person that you're trying to get away from. A lot easier to break those kinds of promises. And if you really have made a private commitment to one another, why refuse to make it public, which is what it comes down to at that point. It's not being like these grade school relationships where, somebody says, well, I'll be your girlfriend as long as you promise not to tell anybody, or I'll be your boyfriend as long as you promise not to tell anybody. Yeah, anytime you have a relationship like that, somebody is taking advantage of somebody else. And when adults are acting in that same childish way, the same thing's really going on there. There's something deeply deceptive about refusing to admit publicly to a commitment. So that excuse doesn't work. Still, other people will say, and this is more common these days with hookup culture, okay, yeah, sex does belong with marriage, but you know what? I'm not going to be getting married for a long time because I'm worried about my education and my career and everything right now, and so I'm not going to be married for a long time. So for now, I'm just going to use sex for fun. And then I'm going to settle down for marriage later, when I'm tired of having fun. And, first of all, not a great way of treating your spouse. Here, want my leftovers? They're a little cold, and I'm not really interested in them anymore, but, have fun. Yeah, not a good way of treating another person, first off. But second of all, there's a deeper reason that this doesn't really wash as a substitute sexual morality either. And if you want a good analogy, I'm going to borrow one from Jay Budziszewski about duct tape. Because you take a piece of duct tape, what's it supposed to do? It is designed to stick. You stick it to something, and it attaches. It's hard to pull off. But if you keep taking that same piece of tape, you stick it to something, you tear it off. You stick it, you tear it off. You stick it, you tear it off. Well, eventually, the tape isn't actually going to stick to anything anymore. Tape gets used up, it gets worn out, it stops sticking. And if you take your tape and you say to yourself and to your tape, like, hey, okay, tape, I don't really want to stick right now. I'm going to put you on this surface, but please don't stick to it. Yeah, it doesn't change anything. It's tape. Tape does what tape does, no matter what you tell it to do. Your intentions don't matter. And it'll stick even if you don't want it to. And if you do keep using it that way, sticking, detaching, it's going to wear out. You're going to damage it each time. And eventually the tape is going to stop being sticky. You will use up the tape. You will prevent it from being able to fulfill its purpose altogether. And once that happens, no amount of telling the tape, hey, I want you to stick, that's not going to change anything either. Because again, the intentions still don't matter. And sexuality, human sexuality acts very, very much in the same way. It is, the Bible describes it as becoming one flesh. Sex attaches you to another person in a very special way. It's what it's for. It's what it does. It's what it is. And our intentions don't change how it works. You stick to the other person whether you want to or not. And when you tear apart from that other person, well, it hurts. Because it's hurting something in both of you. It damages both parties. And just like with the tape, if you're doing that over and over and over again, if you are binding yourself and then tearing yourself apart, you're binding yourself and tearing yourself apart, over time that destroys your capacity for having actual intimacy with another person. There comes a time when you do that for long enough where your sexuality becomes so damaged that it just doesn't do what sex does anymore. Eventually, the tape listens, and it refuses to stick. And again, you talk to people who have been in hookup culture for a long time, and those are some really cynical people. Those are some people who have a lot of trouble actually with the relationships, with actually bonding with other people. It's really easy to see this phenomenon in practice. And we don't accept that. We try to ignore that because modern people, when it comes down to, we are Gnostics. We think that our bodies aren't really us. That we're spirits that inhabit our bodies. We're the ghosts in the shell, and it's on the inside. It's what's on the inside that counts, right? Not your bodies. And our bodies are just some kind of tool that the real us uses in this life when we're stuck in them. It's kind of how we look at it. Completely false, and you can see my video series on Gnosticism for to learn more about that. But that's not the kind of beings that humans are. You can take a screwdriver as a tool, and you can use it to turn a screw, or you can use it as a chisel, which is contrary to its purpose, but you can use it that way, just not very well. And people think that we can do the same thing with our bodies, that you can, instead of using them for what they're designed for, you can use them for other things. But the reality is, our bodies aren't tools that we use. We don't inhabit our bodies. We are our bodies. This is me right here, this flesh and blood. And, you can change what I know by hitting me on the head. You can change how I feel by pumping me full of hormones. If you punch me in the face, you are punching me in the face. You're not just punching some bits of flesh and bone that I have some emotional attachment to. You're punching me. And that doesn't mean that we aren't more than our bodies, because we are more than our bodies. We're not just flesh and bone. But we're certainly not any less than our bodies. So as a result, we don't do things with our bodies. We simply do them ourselves. we lose that layer of abstraction that you could use with that tool driver, where you were using a separate tool for something else. And what that ends up meaning is that we don't get to choose the meaning of our actions. I cannot simply strangle somebody as a way of showing that I love them. That's not what strangling means. Strangling destroys somebody else. It murders. That's what it accomplishes. And hatred is what it means, no matter how you might want to dress that up. Sex is the same way. Sex does what it does. It creates a one-flesh union. And second, it creates children. And again, that's not an option that is entirely up to us. If it were, we would not be aborting almost 1 million unborn children every year. All that money, all that time and education that we spend on contraception and training people to use it, and the reality still doesn't change. Our intentions don't matter nearly so much as we think. And the last excuse, people will say that sure, sex belongs with marriage, but you know what? I'm not going to get married, so I can use sex however I want. And it's a short-sighted excuse, because you know what? You might not want marriage right now, but you might someday. When you grow up. And even if you don't change, you know what? Maybe the people you're sleeping with will. You can't speak for them. A lot of them may very well change their minds later on. And of course, you point this out to people, and they'll say, oh, well, maybe, but they said it was okay, so that's their responsibility. They gave consent, so it's fine. There's no problem. But the second you make that jump, your ethic is no longer, do whatever you want as long as you don't hurt anyone. Your ethic has suddenly become, you can hurt whoever you want as long as you get their permission first. And that is very much hookup culture in a nutshell there. At that point, you lose even the pretense that you're not hurting your partners. You just don't care whether you're hurting them or not. So you can make all of these excuses, you can come up with all these distortions of sexual morality, but at the end of the day, none of them work because none of them are the real deal. All of them lose something very, very important. And when you lose one important thing out of that whole pattern, the rest of it starts to unravel too, and you end up losing everything. And that is where we're going to stop for now. So please like, comment, subscribe, share the videos, and then join us next time when we start turning to some of the practical wisdom of how do we accomplish chastity today.